welcome to the first ever virtual CLE put on by the Minnesota Statewide Alumni Chapter of Phi Alpha Delta Law Fraternity International. We have a lot to cover, so we're going to start right on time, and if people are joining, that's fine. The title of the seminar is Professional Responsibility and Addressing Racial Disparities. What is the lawyer's role? An important topic at this time. Just a few things. Your videos and sound will be muted as an attendee. There is a Q&A function that you can ask questions throughout the program, and we'll leave a little time at the end to answer those. I am going to share my screen here. I wanted to mention one thing. An attorney let me know about a new diversity scholarship program at the University of St. Thomas School of Law. He mentioned particularly that the area of workers' compensation is lacking in diversity in Minnesota. So if you're a student and you're interested in that program, you can email Lisa Brabbit or Dana Gerber. Their email addresses are on screen. We did also request one elimination of bias CLE credit in Minnesota, and that is pending currently. If you want to apply for credit now, you can enter the code on screen and it will say 0 hours, but once it's approved, you'll get the full hour. So if you're only seeking credit for part of the program, you'll have to wait until it's approved. We will also make a recording available on the Minnesota Statewide Facebook page, but we have not applied for on-demand credit for that. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Tisidra Jones. She graduated from the University of St. Thomas School of Law and is licensed to practice in Minnesota and New York. After law school, she worked for the City of St. Paul Human Rights and Equal Economic Opportunity Department, directing small, minority, and women-owned business enterprise vendor outreach programs. She also developed a compliance externship program at the University of St. Thomas School of Law for law students interested in public sector compliance. She started Strong and Starlike Consulting in 2017. She consults with government entities on small, minority, and women-owned business enterprise and inclusion initiatives. She also serves on the board of Legal Corps, which provides free legal advice to low-income business owners. And she has spoken on a number of topics, including rent forbearance and evictions in the face of COVID-19 and the use of deadly force by law enforcement. I'm also happy to announce that she's agreed to be initiated into the Minnesota Statewide Alumni Chapter, so we'll do that at our next meeting. And I'm happy to present the newest member of Minnesota Statewide, Tisidra Jones.
Thank you very much, Corey, for that introduction. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to have a conversation with you all, even though I can't see you as this is a webinar, but really looking forward to having what I consider to be a conversation today about this topic. And so with that, I will begin. So professional responsibility in addressing racial disparities. What is the lawyer's role? So for today's CLE, I like to give an overview in terms of where we're going today, a roadmap for our time together. And then following that, we'll talk a little bit more about what to expect. And so I want to start out today with some defining of shared language so that we're on the same page. I often say that although we could all be speaking English, sometimes we're not speaking the same English, and sometimes we attribute different meanings to different words. I want to also take a moment to talk about how our communities are changing, provide an overview of disparities before I really dig into them, and then spend some time talking about the intersection between laws, policies, and racial economic disparities. And then we'll end today providing you with some examples of efforts that I've been a part of or some colleagues have been involved in, and then also take some time to talk about things that you can do related to this. And so, as Corey had mentioned, for today's CLE, this is an elimination of bias CLE. It is not an ethics CLE, although we will be talking about professional responsibility in terms of the scope, really thinking about that intersection of professional responsibility with this broader discussion of racial economic disparities and how we as lawyers could be able to navigate through that and have a role in making a difference, potentially, depending on what you're able to do. And so with that, first want to dive into defining disparity. So I'm not on the inside, I'm really like 100-year-old woman, truly. So when it comes to some technological things, I'm not all that up to date. And I have many friends who've told me when I get online, don't read the comments with articles. Whether it's us speaking a different kind of English or reading the comments, I found that sometimes we can get a lot lost in translation, even with just one word. And so as it relates to disparity today, I want to be able to say what I mean by that and how I'm talking about it. I've seen many times with articles talking about disparities where people will give examples of, well, especially when we talk about Black-white disparities from an economic perspective, because the white population is larger, even if the percentage is smaller, it means more people are impacted. That may be the case. But however, when we're talking about disparities for today, what we're really focusing on is when there's something that's disproportionate in terms of that outcome, and inconsistency, lack of parity. If all things were still the same, both the percentage of impact that's happening with a specific event and the total number of people that are impacted, that base foundational number were the same, if we apply the same percentage, the 27%, for example, in terms of a disparity related to the white community, and then a 66% related to the Black community, if the base number is the same, we're having a disparate impact on more people. And so I just want to put that out there as a term I want to define clearly, that when we're talking about today, really looking at where we're getting discrepancies and disproportionate impact and outcomes, those are the kind of ways that I'm thinking about disparity and how we're talking about disparities today. I also like to take some time on the front end of presentations to talk about how I think about systems in this work. And so in terms of my background, I'm an artist and a lawyer and a business owner. For a large portion of my life was an artist before going to law school. And so in case there are any visual learners out there, I often like to include fractals as a tool to really think about how we think about systems. And so I'm not sure how many of you all are familiar with what fractals are, but I'm going to share that with you in this moment. So a fractal is a never-ending pattern that occurs in science or nature. It's infinitely complex and self-similar at multiple levels of scale. And so with fractals, when I think about what we're discussing today, at the highest level of scale, patterns create our systems. And at the smallest level of scale within a system, we have people. And so when you look at a fractal, when it talks about repeating and being self-similar, if you look at the smallest component and were to blow this up on your wall, it would create this image, no matter how big or how small. The interesting thing about fractals is if you change even a smallest component within that pattern, you can ultimately change the whole picture. So when we're talking about systems today and talking about racial economic disparities, I'm talking about the patterns that are created within our laws and policies, what systems they're creating. And ultimately, when we put those systems and patterns together to create this broader image, are we liking the image that we're seeing? And if we aren't, as a community, liking the image that we're seeing as a result of the systems that's created, what patterns can we start to shift at the smallest level of scale to ultimately start to shift the bigger picture? And so I offer that to you all to keep in mind as we think about systems and systems change. The other thing that I want to mention and why focusing on racial economic disparities today is because there are so many different disparities that we've seen in the news. 2020 was quite a year, from the disparities that people have discussed related to COVID, certainly with criminal justice and George Floyd's murder, but also when we think about all these different pieces, whether it's housing, criminal justice, job, workforce development, business development, what I tend to come back to is thinking about it like the spoke on a wheel for a bike. And that economic impact and economic disparities are really connected or intersect with so many of these other broader discussions that we talk about when we talk about systems, systems change, building systems, and our laws and policies. And that's why that's a central discussion for today, and thinking about the lawyer's role and what could be done. So in thinking about our communities, and before jumping into racial disparities, want to talk about why this really matters today. We've been having discussions about systems that haven't been working, or disparities in systems for decades and now going on centuries, but want to be able to take a moment to note that why does this matter today? And with that, demographic shifts are really important. Currently, if you look at the image that we have here on the screen, by 2045, the US Census Bureau is reporting that the United States will be, for the first time, majority people of color. And so that's something to keep in mind. In addition, in 2017, the Minnesota State Demographer reported that St. Paul was majority people of color. 89% of Minnesota immigrants live in urban communities. And these last two circles here highlight that by 2030, essentially it's highlighting that our communities are also getting older. So not only is our workforce starting to get older, with baby boomers taking up a big chunk of our workforce, in addition, our communities are becoming more diverse racially and ethnically. And so we keep that in mind because when we're talking about racial economic disparities, and back to that definition and example I gave with disparity as a term, if the population of Blacks, Indigenous, and people of color is also increasing and new Americans are increasing in our country, and the rate at which we're seeing disparities continue, then that's going to have a much broader impact than it did yesterday and than it does today as we look to the future. So I want to take a moment to ground you in some of these racial economic disparities in the US and here in Minnesota before we really dig in. The top row highlights economic disparities, Black-white racial economic disparities in the US, and the bottom row, Minnesota. There are disparities that exist between all communities of color, but really a lot of the discussion we'll have today will dig into Black-white disparities because in some areas, those are the starkest disparities that we're seeing in this discussion of racial economic disparities. As you can see, moving from left to right, income disparities and the income gap between Blacks and whites, then home ownership rates, and then looking at poverty rates. And comparing the top and bottom row, the US versus Minnesota, you can see that for Minnesota in some areas, these disparities are almost twice that as the US as a whole. Minnesota has been reported to have some of the starkest racial economic disparities in the country. And so for those of you who are attendees who are in Minnesota, I also try to be an optimist and believe that with having so many stark disparities and thinking about the demographic shifts taking place in our country and here in Minnesota, this presents an opportunity for us in this time to think about this differently and start to think about strategies and practices and roles that we can play within how we address, how we discuss, how we analyze economic disparities that are taking place right here in our own backyard for those of you in Minnesota and those of you who are not looking at our country as a whole. So as lawyers, what does that mean for us? Why should lawyers be talking about and thinking about racial economic disparities more broadly? Well, within the ABA's model rules of professional conduct, as well as Minnesota's rules of professional conduct, there's actually language that touches on some of this, both addressing how we should be seeking improvement of the law, as well as furthering the public's understanding. Now that I have your attention as to we have a professional responsibility, I want to unpack that just a little bit more. This language is found in the preamble of the responsibilities, professional responsibilities, both for the ABA and for Minnesota. And if you look at the preamble, I will say that the preamble is offered as a general orientation while the rules are actually authoritative. But in considering what the preamble states a lawyer's responsibility, it is worth digging into just a little bit. In paragraph 1, you'll see in both ABA and Minnesota that 3 roles are really kind of identified if you unpack it a little bit. And what those roles are is that lawyers, 1, are representative of clients, 2, officers of the legal system, and 3, they are public citizens. And so in paragraph 6, that really digs into what it means to be a public citizen a little bit more. And so as public citizens, it notes, I like to unpack and break things down, 4 different things that we should be thinking about as attorneys. Seeking improvement, that's seeking improvement of the law, seeking improvement of access to the legal system. It involves seeking improvement to the administration of the actual rules and legal system. So that's one area where we should be seeking to take on a role and advance. So if the laws aren't playing out as they ought to be, and that's a broader discussion, but rather if the laws are resulting in outcomes that can ultimately, moving down to that third point, start to chip away at the public's understanding and confidence in our rule of law, then that could spark a need to start to think about where laws may need improvement. In addition, it goes on to note that we should seek to cultivate and employ knowledge. That's both within the legal field, and as the next point notes, broadening that public understanding. And with bullet point 3, the public understanding and confidence, I find this to be rather important. In the work that I do, we do engage in quite a bit of community engagement. And we go out to communities that have to navigate laws and policies and government systems. Many times, especially when interacting with communities of color, we have conversations of a breach of trust and distrust of bigger systems and laws and policies. And so that positions the government entity and community in this place seeking to rebuild trust. And so when we talk about furthering understanding and confidence within the law, if we don't have that confidence in place, the preamble goes on to say that this is needed because legal institutions in a constitutional democracy depend on popular participation and support to maintain authority. And so as an undergrad, I minored in the sociology of difference, and I really enjoyed sociology. And I remember on the first day of class, the professor really talked about our social contracts and agreements that we make with each other. As simple as driving down the road, we agree that you're not going to cross the white line or the yellow line. But when we start to have these promises and these agreements that break down, then accidents can occur. And so when I look at that and zoom out and apply it to what's being said here related to the public understanding and confidence within our law and maintaining for its ability to maintain authority, if there continues to be a breach of that confidence, a breach of that trust, then a question for me arises, what do those in that position where they feel like their confidence in our laws and trust in our systems has been chipped away so much, what happens to their confidence, but also the ability to have that authority for it to make a difference and for people to trust its ability to do what it's intended to. And lastly, the paragraph goes on to talk about being mindful of deficiencies. And that tends to correlate directly with what we're talking about here with racial economic disparities. And so whether that's people who are unable to access the legal system from a low income perspective, but also more broadly, when I see that, I think about how to look at how our systems may have deficiencies or again, be yielding disparate impact in terms of how it's applied. And that prompts an opportunity to look at that a little bit more closely. So lastly, on this part, want to talk about some relevant rules to keep in mind. Now, for each of these, when I get to the end and provide some examples of things that you can do in this broader conversation, we'll talk about these just a little bit more and looking to the comments within the rules to offer some guidelines in terms of what they've said more broadly could apply, and then also using some examples of things that I've seen within my work and the work of some of my colleagues and mentors. But here, Rule 6.1, 6.3, and 6.4 are worth noting to keep in mind. Often when we think about voluntary pro bono service, we're thinking about working with a client who otherwise cannot afford the services. But there's such a much broader range of things that lawyers can do that are right there in the rules. In addition, keeping in mind what it looks like to be a member within a legal services organization, and with 6.4 law reform activities, which I'll talk about more. I will say to keep in mind with these rules and what you're doing to work in public service, that you'll also want to keep some other professional responsibility rules in mind, especially those related to conflicts of interest, past clients, things of that nature, as you look to dig into some of this work. So those would still apply also, and would encourage you to remain cognizant of those. And also for any lawyers who are government employees or officers, there are laws that'll intersect that you would want to keep in mind as well. And so with that, we're going to dive into, I tend to think of things in buckets. This first big bucket that relates to laws, policies, and racial economic disparities. And so in addition to the fractal image, I really enjoy timelines. So in my spare time, I enjoy drinking a glass of wine and reading Census Bureau reports, as well as reports from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That's a fun Friday night for me. And I like creating timelines because I think that sometimes a picture can be worth 1,000 words. And so what this timeline is depicting here is from 1865 to the 2010. To the 2010s. And so in looking at this timeline, I wanted to highlight 1 to 2 laws or policies or practices that were in place that in one way or another have intersected with economic impact, economic opportunity, equal economic opportunity, just economic access, specifically looking at the relationship between Blacks and whites, but many of these laws also intersecting with communities of color. And so in looking at this timeline to ground us in the laws and policies before digging into some of the actual impact, the racial disparities. I want to highlight here on this slide I wasn't going for a Christmas theme, but now I see that has the color scheme, but wanting to show that the green were times in history where progress was being made in terms of Black economic opportunity and minimizing the impact of past disparities that were resulting because of laws and policies in place, while the red will demonstrate a law or policy that was in place that really did have a disparate outcome or impact on economic opportunity for communities of color and largely the Black community. And so in looking at that, we can see that there are these spurts here of green and longer stretches of red. So I like to look back in history. So in addition to reading Census Bureau reports, I do spend a lot of time with my grandmothers and their friends, or I did. And part of that I really enjoyed was the wisdom that was shared. So each of my grandmothers often spoke in terms of parables and riddles, which as a kid wasn't very helpful to understanding what they were trying to convey, but as an adult has been useful to understanding things. One grandmother used to say that if you don't know your history, you're bound to repeat it. And another one would say that there's nothing new under the sun. So in looking at this timeline here, I want to ground us in keeping that in the back of our mind, and that for a number of these things, different laws and policies that showed up years ago, there are rippling effects and impacts of those decisions. In addition, some of those laws and policies, although maybe eradicated or shifted, have different forms that have morphed into different forms in present day with similar rippling impact. And so taking a quick look back at the Black codes, right after the end of slavery, different states across the South, first starting in South Carolina, implemented these Black codes that disproportionately impacted Black communities, directly looking at creating laws that put a block on things such as impacting employment, among other things that they're able to do. But the nice thing with this green area is that for this period of Reconstruction from 1865 to 1867, and coming off of the Civil Rights Act that came at the end of slavery, there was a lot of progress for the Black community during that time. However, at the end of that period with 1877, we saw more laws being implemented, such as pig laws, where you'd be criminalized or put in jail for where the crime and the time didn't necessarily align, for things such as taking a pig, being out after dark, walking on the side of a railroad track, speaking loudly in the presence of white women. All these things became laws that were disproportionately impacting and enforced against Black men. And then following that, going into Jim Crow, which as you can see ran from the 1880s to the 1960s, is a timeline of laws and policies. Within that time, I won't go into each of these in great detail, but we had acts such as the Social Security Act exclusion and Wagner Act exclusions that impacted both retirement abilities and unions and labor forces. We look at those who are non-whites. In addition, the timeline goes on to provide examples of laws and policies that impacted the ability to get a home and home ownership overall, both back then, but also as recent as subprime loans and predatory lending in the 2000s. And then this next green spot that we have here looks at the civil rights era progress that was being made. But then as we get to the 1980s, and I'll talk about some of these in greater detail in a moment, we have the war on drugs and how that had an impact in terms of economic advancement that was taking place. And so as I move into these next three buckets that I want to talk to you about related to income disparities, wealth disparities, and then incarceration, I'll reference some of these laws in a few more details examples, but again, wanted to paint the picture as we can see decade after decade after decade, what picture is this creating when you really dig into the laws, the policies, but most importantly, the outcomes and the impact that it's having on specific communities and the disparities that are resulting from that. So first I want to dive into income disparities. And so in looking back, holding in mind some elements of that timeline that was just covered, as it relates to the income disparities, we're looking at a timeline here from 1967 to 2019. And so the US Census Bureau 2019 report on income and poverty in the United States presented this chart within it. So that look back. And I had read the report from 2018 as well. And so in 2019, there is a 30,619 Black, white income gap in terms of median household income. In 2018, that amount has increased from 2018, actually, by at least 1,338. So small amount, but still an increase nonetheless. And looking at the Black-white income gap in 1967, the income gap at that time was 19,424. So as you can see, from 1967, after the Civil Rights Act and all the great efforts there, to the present, our Black-white income gaps have actually increased by quite a bit. In addition, when we think about income gaps and some of these disparities, sometimes I've had people have questions around, well, in terms of income, what's leading to this income in terms of the job? What kind of jobs are Blacks and communities of color taking on that contributes to these gaps that we're discussing here? Well, in thinking about the timeline again, and we'll highlight briefly the Social Security Act exclusions that were noted. Folks have different positions of thought in terms of the exclusions creation and intention behind them, but my focus is not the intention, but my focus is the outcome and the disparities that resulted. So the 1935 Social Security Act exclusions actually excluded agricultural and domestic workers. At that time in history, Blacks, as well as all other non-whites, since the data at that time didn't disaggregate, but had Blacks and other non-whites, had over 60% of their community members who were in the workforce were working in domestic and agricultural positions. The Social Security Act exclusions excluded Blacks and non-whites from being included within the Social Security Act benefits that were available at that time. And so similarly to 1935, where those jobs in terms of domestic and agricultural workers were lower paying, lower wage jobs, and poverty wage jobs, which I'll say a little bit more about now. Even yet today, there is a higher percentage of Blacks and community and Hispanics in lower wage jobs and poverty earning jobs. And so keeping that in mind, that with a lower wage job, that impacts your income overall and ultimately wealth, which we'll talk about in a moment. And so as it relates to poverty level wage jobs, 14.3% of Blacks are in poverty wage level jobs as opposed to 8.6% of whites. The US Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that in its 2019 report. In addition, there are reports that highlight that service occupations weekly earnings, which a higher percentage of Blacks and community and Hispanics are in service occupation positions, their weekly earnings tend to average around $480, as opposed to management and professional weekly earnings, which on average are around $1,250. And so keeping in mind the amount that people are earning and what we have here in this chart, those contribute to some of those income gaps. In addition, poverty rate in America, overall, the poverty rate for Blacks and whites has always been higher, with Blacks roughly about twice as high as whites. So in 2019, the Black poverty rate was 18.8%, while the white poverty rate was 7.3%, and overall poverty of 10.5%. In terms of wage gaps, even when Blacks and Hispanics have a bachelor's degree or higher, their median weekly earnings are still less than Asians and whites, respectively Blacks and whites at $1,065 and Hispanics at $1,101, with Asians and whites earning $1,465 and $1,342. So again, even with similar factors such as educational attainment, there's still wage gaps that are existing. And I will say, as much as this presentation won't dig into in depth the impacts related to COVID, because those are continuing to show up. As of May of last year, as it relates to unemployment, overall, Blacks have had a higher unemployment rate, but with COVID, things did worsen. So by May of last year, Black and Hispanic unemployment rate were higher, and layoffs were higher than they were for whites at that time, with Black unemployment increasing from 6% to 16.8% by May of last year. And so that's just providing that foundation in terms of the economic disparities. And I start with economic disparities because I start with income disparities, in discussing economic disparities, because then that creates this foundation for those who have a conversation of, well, how do you navigate, how do you fix this? And talking about, is it income or is it wealth disparities? Well, if you don't have the income and you don't have the job, then that will ultimately contribute to how you're able to build wealth. And so with that, I want to say a little bit about wealth building and economic security. So between the early 1960s to 2016 to 2016, 2019, the wealth gap has not really changed. Similar to the income gap, we haven't seen much progress. As you can see, the Black-white income gap is 10 times. There's a 10 times difference. Whites' income or wealth building wealth is 10 times greater than Blacks. Something else to keep in mind too, since this slide only goes to 2016, is that between 2016 and 2019, median wealth did rise for all races and ethnic groups. And during that time, Blacks and Hispanics did see a faster rate in terms of their wealth growth, rising from 33 and 63% respectively compared to white families. However, although they were having these gains and wealth was increasing at a faster rate, it did not have an impact on the wealth gap, which continues to persist between Blacks and Hispanics and whites. The next thing I want to note is the net worth component to keep in mind. And so when we talk about wealth building and net worth, there are multiple factors that are taken into consideration there. And so when I was looking into some of the different assets and considerations for what goes into net worth and where there are disparities between Blacks and whites and Hispanics, as you can see here, stark difference between these two lines in terms of Black, Hispanics, and whites in terms of the net worth between 1989 up through 2016. And so in looking at those gaps, things that are taken into consideration with the net worth that contributed to this chart done with the Hamilton Project was looking at things such as checking accounts, savings accounts, stocks, equity in businesses, rental property, home ownership, each of those pieces. The Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland actually issued a report in 2019 called "What is Behind the Persistent Racial Wealth Gap?" And in looking in that report, they were looking at the different assets that Blacks and whites and Hispanics had in place. And in drilling down into the assets of Blacks and whites, they were looking at what percentage of Blacks and whites had a particular type of asset and how much that asset took up in terms of their overall, what percentage each individual asset took up in their broader assets in total. And so in looking at charts like that, for Blacks, home equity, checkings and savings and vehicles were the highest assets, the ones that people had the most of, and that took up the most space. Similarly to whites. However, where there's a big difference is when looking at stocks, as well as real estate, additional real estate besides your home, and then business and other investments. And looking at these reports, it showed that more whites were engaging in those investments and those assets, and more had a higher percentage in there ultimately as well. And so each of those things contributing to the ultimate net worth and wealth that communities are able to build. Another thing that I want to be able to talk about in greater detail here is looking at home ownership. There's been a lot of research discussion around home ownership rates between Blacks and whites and Hispanics over time, but want to provide just a little more context on a few things. And so in looking at this, we can see that there is a disparity. There's a gap between Blacks and whites and Hispanics and whites as it relates to the home ownership rate. And so in 2016, there was an article by the Russell Sage Foundation of Social Sciences looking at inequities from 96 to 2011, and noted that these gaps that exist as it pertains to home ownership aren't just in terms of the rate of home ownership, but also in the value of home ownership and when people are looking to sell their homes, actual value that they're getting, and demonstrated that whites are receiving higher returns on their investments than Blacks and Hispanics. And so each of these pieces really contributing to the broader wealth gap and disparities that we're seeing. And when we think again back to that timeline of laws and policies, we'll see that there were a few laws that I had glossed over there, which we'll say a little bit more about now. And so through the 1930s and 1940s, there were government programs with subsidized low-cost loans to buy homes. However, tied to those loans was a classification where loan eligibility, was tied to race, with non-whites considered to be a higher risk factor. And as a result, this increased the loan denial of non-whites in terms of home ownership. In addition, others have discussed the impact of the GI Bill that provided for low interest mortgages in 1944. And although not necessarily in the law, in terms of the administration of the act, it's been reported that there are a number of barriers that prevented Blacks from being able to reap the full benefits of the act, especially as it relates to home ownership. In addition, although the 1948 Supreme Court case of Shelley v. Kramer, it outlawed restrictive covenants, private developers still refused to sell to non-whites during that time. In addition, in 2014, Ta-Nehisi Coates had an article entitled The Case for Reparations. And in this article, he had noted that as late, again, thinking timeline-wise, coming off of Shelley v. Kramer, as late as the early 1950s, that the National Association of Real Estate Boards Code of Ethics instructed that realtors should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood any race or, excuse me, any race or nationality or any individuals whose presence would be detrimental to property values. It went on to explain who those individuals would be and stated that such individuals could include a colored man of means who was giving his children a college education and thought that they were entitled to live among whites. And this is going back to the 1950s. And so building on that timeline wise, the 50s to the 60s, lots of stories of evidence of freeways being built through Black neighborhoods and destroying homes, which those of you in Minnesota would be familiar with those things happening right here with the Rondo community. And then fast forwarding to the 2000s and 2010s, where we see these subprime loans and predatory lending by financial institutions. So when we talk about systems and change and laws and policies intersecting with these racial economic disparities, there is an intersection. We're seeing the rippling effects of decisions where if you start to build them upon the edge, or if you have generation and generation having poverty and not access to higher earning jobs or wage gaps generation after generation, how that can impact wealth building. And then when you have barriers with the highest asset being homes for many people across Black and white and other communities of color, that when we look at that and consider the barriers that we had just discussed, even as recent as the 2000s and 2010s, that these things will chip away at the ability for people to build wealth and have that economic opportunity, as well as economic mobility and ability to leave behind generational wealth, which a number of reports have highlighted higher rates and discrepancies in terms of what families are able to pass on from generation to build that generational wealth, which in light of what we've just talked about, kind of connects those dots. Lastly, I want to talk about incarceration and economic opportunity before I go into providing you all some examples. So as it relates to incarceration, economic opportunity, just putting some figures here on the wall, I'm sure many of you all have heard before, but Blacks make up 13% of the US population, but make up 40% of those in state and federal prisons. And so I want to fold incarceration into this discussion of racial economic disparities and economic opportunity, because with so many people within the Black community incarcerated, but also if we were to go into looking at Hispanic and Indigenous communities, those rates continue to be high as well there, that having one, communities becoming more diverse by race and ethnicity, and also our workforce aging out, so creating gaps in terms of workforce, that if we're having such significant populations that are seen to be increasing, also incarcerated, what does that do for our overall economy, as well as their individual economic opportunity? So in looking at incarceration, I want to take a second to do a little bit of a look back at some of those laws again. So I'd mentioned when going through that timeline following Reconstruction that there were laws that were put in place that were disproportionately impacting Black males. And some of those included vagrancy statutes that required Blacks to demonstrate that they were employed. And when they weren't able to demonstrate that, then we would see examples where they would have arrests and have to be locked up until they were able to pay off these fines. And so if they weren't able to pay off the fines associated with being locked up, then they would stay there until they were able to do so. All of these things are things to keep in mind. I mentioned the past to connect to the present as well, because there are recent reports that, for example, the Brennan Center for Justice published a report in 2019 looking at the steep cost of criminal justice fees and fines. And they conducted an analysis looking at 3 states, Texas, Florida, and New Mexico. And looking at those fines and fees that were imposed, they have such a hefty impact on those who are incarcerated, but also for the families. With an inability to pay those fines, there can be barriers such as license suspension, which then gets in the way of being able to get to a job. Also can impact the fines and fees abilities to do other things such as pay child support, get locked up again, all these things connecting and having an economic impact that upon release from incarceration, what's this next economic hurdle to overcome and take care of. In their report, they do make policy recommendations as to things that could help to remedy this and minimize this desperate impact, especially on underserved communities related to the fines and fees. And so again, connecting those dots that all know not the same as 1877, thinking about the economic impact of fines and fees and people's ability to get a job, earn a living, and take care of their families. In addition, looking at this slide, I'm going to highlight that thinking about the wealth in the 1970s was really interesting in looking at in the research that we've conducted is that during that time, that was a period where the Black and white income gap were able to narrow by quite a bit during that period. However, the advancements that were made in the late 60s and 1970s were quickly reversed when the war on drugs began in the 1980s. And so the war on drugs in 1980s had such a huge impact with an increase of mass incarceration, and that could be seen in the reports by the Federal Reserve Bank highlighting this shift from the 1970s and 1980s in terms of wage, in terms of income gaps. And then also thinking again about the families and being able to allow for families to come out of these generational poverty. Once a parent, a father goes into prison, it's been noted that there's a 22% decrease in the family's income while the parent is incarcerated. And then a 15% decrease, even after the father comes back from being incarcerated, the income is still 15% lower than before incarcerated. And then in terms of other costs, just noting that from being able to call a loved one in prison, if you give a call at least once a week for 1 hour, that call can total $250 per month. And so thinking about these additional costs and fees that we don't think about for community members who could be already low income and facing some of these economic hurdles just to get to even thinking about one of the low wage jobs. In addition, just a few more things to note here before going into some final examples. Want to highlight that 60% of formerly incarcerated people remain unemployed a year after release. That's all incarcerated people. What's interesting there is that when we think about callback rates, so there's a 50% reduction in employer callbacks for formerly incarcerated whites, while there's a 65% reduction for Blacks. And in terms of wage reduction after incarceration, there's a 2% wage reduction for formerly incarcerated whites, while there's a 9% wage reduction for formerly incarcerated Blacks. So in light of all of this, thinking about income, wealth, and the timeline that was presented, what are a few examples of things that I've done and things that others have been able to do in their work that connect those dots to some of those professional responsibilities that I had mentioned? So we'll share just a few of those. In terms of the work that I do on a day-to-day basis, I would certainly credit a number of great mentors and colleagues that I've had that helped to shift the way that I look at our systems and see things a little differently. So in our day-to-day work that we do at Strong and Starlike really focuses on connecting dots. And so looking at engaging communities who would be impacted by laws and policies so that their voices are a part of that decision-making process, but then also thinking about how their experiences, what they're sharing, can help inform how policy is created. We also are involved in developing public programs, again, taking a look and assessment at these disparate incomes and disparities that exist and understanding what are some of those root causes, and then offering an assessment as to how to change some of those things. In addition, as mentioned earlier, with economics at the center of this wheel and just the spokes coming off of that, we see that a lot of these systems intersect. And to be able to think about sustainable, impactful change, cross-sector approaches are required to do that. And so a number of our projects and efforts that we take on will deal with cross-sector approaches and cross-sector solutions. And I know we go to law school and we learn in this traditional lawyering approach, but also there are other approaches that lawyers could take to lawyering. And that can include a community lawyering approach that can have you working more in partnership with community members and organizations as you think about disparities and challenges and barriers and struggles that community members are facing, again, with that lens towards the professional responsibility. And if we need to think about improvement of the law, why not think about it and working with those community members who are being impacted disproportionately? And so just a couple of examples for seeking improvement of the law, prison phone justice. And so Dr. Artika Tyner in the Center for Race Leadership and Social Justice, she's had a long history in terms of research and efforts focusing on prison phone justice. And one of their goals that they've done is to ensure that prison rates, the price rate for prison phone calls as mentioned on that slide a couple slides ago, are just, reasonable, and fair. And so they focused on raising awareness, supporting community mobilization, and promoting policy reform related to prison phone justice. Again, I remember a couple slides ago, I mentioned that $250 a month cost if there's a 1 hour phone call a week for family members. That can add up. In addition, looking at collateral consequences. Again, this is just an introduction, which I've been able to provide today, but there's so many collateral consequences after incarceration that connect to economic opportunity, from housing to jobs, getting loans, starting businesses, getting professional licenses and trades. All of these are things to take into consideration. And that's work that, again, I'll use an example with Dr. Tyner and the Center for Race Leadership and Social Justice. They've engaged in work that focuses on the research and impact of policy related to these things, as well as advocating policy changes at state and national levels. Other examples to consider in terms of our work, my deeper level of expertise and work that I do the most in this area of economic opportunity pertains to business owners. And so in research that we've conducted, one thing, kind of thinking about that net worth slide that I had shown that can chip away at that gap, is actually business ownership. There have been studies that have found that Black business owners are 12 times, their net worth is 12 times that of non-business owners within the Black community. And so a lot of our work really does look at support laws, policies, programs that focus on minority business efforts and support, breaking down barriers related to access to capital that people have commented on, and working with government entities to look at their government contracting and procurement practices, and using a lens to assess where potential barriers could exist for all who are wanting to contract with them, but also those that can have a disparate impact on certain communities of color. Another area, kind of thinking back to the professional rules, again, thinking about efforts that further public understanding of the law. And so we have partnered and worked with people and organizations in the past, such as the International Leadership Institute, the Minnesota Hispanic Bar Association, related to CLE series, but also civic education workshops. So as we're learning and hearing from community members and hearing about changes in laws and policies, creating spaces where there could be people to talk about, how do you navigate this? Sometimes just figuring out how to navigate a process or who to call is a really big step for an individual, especially when in crisis. And so collaborating with others to further that public understanding about how to navigate these systems could help in minimizing some of those outcomes. In addition, community engagement initiatives is something that we've taken on in partnership, but also through the work that we do, as I had mentioned earlier, listening to community members who have said they have lost the trust in our systems and in our government or otherwise, and thinking about how do you build those bridges and start to make shifts there. And so lastly, I want to say just a couple of quick things in terms of what you can do. What can you do? And so in light of all the examples that I've shared and looking back at the timeline and the history and some of the disparities, I want to say in two buckets, what you could do within your firm, your business, your organization, and then as an individual. And so here are just a few examples of things to consider, such as doing pay equity assessments within your organization, looking at your new hires and promotions between different kind of occupational categories and across disaggregated data for the community members of color, how to think about that. Assessing the economic impact of your policies related to who do you buy from, who do you purchase from, your vendor inclusion for your company or business. Is that something you've thought about? And if you haven't, why not? And maybe you should. Practices and policies that can make your organization a welcoming environment for all. And there are a number of examples that different agencies have started to put in place that could be modeled as well, to think about that more deeply. And on that individual level, we'll just highlight a few things here to think about. Within Rule 6.1, it gives a long list of activities in terms of the comments that you can actually do, whether that's supporting, representing from a pro bono perspective, but also legislative lobbying, administrative rulemaking, provisions where you can assist with free training. In addition, you're able to think about ways that you can serve with organizations that are doing this work to improve the law more broadly. Lots of different examples within the comments. You could also run for office. I saw a number of people who were they continue to see the same outcomes within their government and their community, so they ran for office. And there are a number of lawyers who've done that. Another thing to think about is mastering the step up and step back. When I hear lawyers and people who wanting to be allies say that I want to do something, I want to change, I think it's really important for people to think about what it means to step up and step back. And what that looks like is sometimes leading and helping means creating space for others to have the space to lead as well, and supporting them in doing that. Last two pieces, I would say read. Expand your own learning on what's happening related to these topics so that your lens could shift to see things from a broader perspective, or perspective that might be different from your own experience. And then lastly, would note that in terms of something to think about is asking questions. We're trained to ask questions. One question that I hold in mind is when we're thinking about policy or creating procedures or programs is it possible that this policy is drafted may have a disparate impact on any group we serve or who works with us? And if we do not know the answer, should we talk to these groups? I just challenge you to hold that question in mind and think about that. My grandma used to tell my mom that I could question the legs off of a donkey. And I now take that as a compliment, in that when something is new and can have an impact for communities, I would challenge you all to think about how you can question the legs off that donkey before you put it out into the world. And so with that, I'll say thank you. Kind of rushed to the end, but thank you for your time to share some of this information with you. And we'll stand for questions now if there are any, Corey.
Thank you, Tisidra. That was very informative. I learned a lot. I'm glad we're recording. I think I need to watch it again. I have a few questions. So you mentioned home ownership contributing to the disparity gap. I did want to mention a program. It's called Mapping Prejudice that the U of M is doing, and they're going through deeds looking for racially restrictive covenants. So there will be clauses in there saying things like you cannot sell this land or this house to a Black person. Mm-hmm. And that's something you can just go through. You don't even have to be a lawyer. If you want to share it with your friends, I'll post the link. You can just look at deeds, look at as many as you want, and look for that racially restrictive language. So how do we resolve things like generational wealth gaps and housing gaps? And I know some proposals are not very popular, like state taxes and things like reparations. So how do we handle things that it's not just income, it's how much money this family has squirreled away? How do we do that equitably?
That's a big question. It's evidenced by lots of articles that I've seen.
8 minutes we have left.
Yes, so the time we have left. So I would say that there are a lot of, to your point, a lot of different folks, whether that's those who work in the Federal Reserve, economists, have presented ideas for policy reform or changes. I would say one thing to think about, the biggest thing that I would say that could be useful is thinking about all of this as a broader system. And what I mean by that is when I used to work in government for the city of St. Paul, there was a point in time where I'll call it an opportunity. I had the opportunity to serve on over 30 different advisory boards, committees, and councils across multiple sectors. And I'll never forget the moment when I realized as I went from one sector to the next that we're all talking about the same problems, just using different language. And everybody keeps doing the same thing in their own lane. I would really encourage for leaders across sectors to stop and start to think about more holistic cross-sector approaches to solving these problems. I think starting with policies related to collateral consequences and the different fees and fines that are amassed there could be a big way to start chipping away at that, but then also being able to do assessments and thinking about the opportunities for pay equity and the pay gap and income gap, and then also just financial literacy and financial education are just a few top things to start to look at and think about that can start to shift it. But if we continue to have laws and policies that are yielding these disparities in their outcomes, then we need to start to think about how these policies should be shifting.
Great. And you mentioned sociology and systems and a lot of statistics. Why isn't it enough to resolve these disparities at the individual level? What do we need to do at the system level to to change those graphs?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good question. I think that at the systems level, again, the cross-sector approaches are really important. But then being able to, you can pick any one of those and start. We can look at home ownership, and I think it's a holistic model, serving the individual and serving the community. I think there's a level of community education around financial literacy, but then also some systems in place are really overly complex, in my opinion, personally. And being able to increase that public education on how to navigate it. But then again, if any particular institution is seeing a disparity in their lending, to get into why and changing those policies and practices. And then when we look at the pay gaps again, I would say for each company organization here to do those kinds of assessments as it relates to their promotion and hiring practices, and thinking about where to make changes there. If you're considering to see that those promotions aren't happening as they should, what needs to happen at that level to ensure equity in those spaces as well? I know it's a broad question with a lot of possible solutions, but I really stand by for me, it's this process of talking to the people impacted, listening actually to what they're saying are the problems and the barriers, and starting to rebuild policies that take that into consideration. And I think that can yield better results because there are some who just don't have a history and practice of doing that.
Great, thank you. We have some questions from the attendees. From Nicole Grita, what's your best advice for getting involved in local government if you're not able to run for public office?
That's a good question. Well, just thinking. So one example, when I used to work for the government, we would do these, I guess, kind of using the language of professional responsibility, civic education type of workshops and sessions. They're really focusing on navigating these complex systems, and helping people figure out how to do that. And so we would partner with different legal organizations like Legal Corps. We would partner with SCORE, all these different service providers that could help specific to business and economic opportunity in that arena, would have everybody come together and allow people in community to stop by each of these stations and get to figure out and learn more about how to navigate these systems. So one example there is, if you don't and you're focused on economic opportunity with businesses, volunteering with an organization like Legal Corps and Brief Advice Clinics is a great space to help people there. And they have partnerships and they work with a number of government entities. And so even if you can't go directly in that way, you can be involved in some of these workshops and community efforts where they're furthering education for people.
Great. And another question from John Karasik. Are there education programs out there to make sure that small business owners know about the 8A program and other federal programs to benefit disadvantaged small businesses?
Yes, there are. There are a lot of great government employees out there who do workshops. I actually, now that I'm on the other side, I think I get at least 1 or 2 emails from the program managers for that each week by signing up on the listserv. So those exist, but I can also say in working with government, something so many people would say when we would come together and say, how do we get the word out, is this gap of how to get more people to know that these things exist. And I think that's a broader discussion that many are having and thinking about how to be accessible in their communication as well. But in short, it does exist.
Great. And Jacqueline Justice had a great question. You see, on TV, criminal defense attorneys bringing up broader racial disparities sometimes during trial. What tips might you have for representing clients in court and bringing to the court's attention these disparities in the hopes of spreading awareness to the system as a whole?
That is a good question. And so I would say I tend to work more on the economic side. As I told my parents, my dad said I could have been a trial lawyer. I said, I'd rather just focus on transactional and money. But with that, I think there are a few different things that can be done there. Earlier in my career working in that space, I think one example, and this is going way back as a case as an example, but in Board B and Brown v. Board, they did use a number of disparities in economic data in trying to advance why separate is not equal. And I think being able to fold in that sociological and disparity research to raise that awareness, but then tying it, connecting the dots with actual case law and outcomes, I think painting that picture could help to to raise awareness. And that might be an exhibit or something that can visualize what's being said. Again, like I said before, sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words to help connect those dots as to why this is a bigger problem.
Great. We have a few minutes. Do you have any book recommendations for us?
Any book recommendations? I am reading a few books. I'm finishing the Color of Law, but I also would say, like I said in the presentation, it may have been funny, but it wasn't a joke. I read a lot of census reports and the recent executive order that was just put in place related to racial equity. And so at this time, from that broader systems perspective, I'm reading a lot related to what's about to change from the top down and thinking about what policies to impact. So I would say Color of Law. If you never read The New Jim Crow, would say to read that as well as two at the top of the list right now. Oh, great.
Good deal. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Like I said, we are pending CLE credit here, and thank you to Tisidra Jones for a great presentation. Welcome to Phi Alpha Delta. And we are hoping to do a series, so look out for next month at another talk by Minnesota Statewide. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.